Masculinity and femininity discourse is popular in certain circles, including academic circles, feminist circles, especially masculinity discourse. People talk a lot about positive and negative masculinity, toxic masculinity. They explain things in terms of masculinity, and you hear this word thrown out a lot in the kinds of circles that I move in any case, which tends to be a little bit academic, progressive sorts of spaces. Although I'm not right now working as an academic, nevertheless, I've had enough interactions, been involved in academic stuff, although I'm in philosophy and not in the social sciences. Nevertheless, there's enough connection there that I've heard a lot of this discourse. And I wanted to give my opinion on the use of these terms masculinity and femininity, whether I think it's useful. Should we have this discourse of masculinity and femininity? I don't just mean conversations on the topic. I mean, like, should we use these terms at all? Should we categorize things as masculine or feminine? And if so, how should we do it? So I'll start by distinguishing between three senses of masculinity, femininity discourse. The first is a descriptive sense. This is a sense in which masculinity and femininity just refers to actual differences in behavior between men and women. So, for example, you might say that aggression is more of a masculine characteristic because men are more aggressive than women. At least physically, they are more aggressive, and overall, probably they're more aggressive. And so then you could say, well, aggression is a masculine characteristic. Women show higher degrees of care and empathy, and so care and empathy can be classified as feminine characteristics. Now, the problem with this sense of the term, this purely descriptive sense, is that for whatever reason, and this is not going to end or go away ever, masculinity and femininity is also associated with people's gender identity. That is, people's identity as men, women, or some non-binary identity is inherently going to be connected to the idea of masculinity or femininity. So if somebody identifies as a man, then their identity becomes linked with this term masculinity and the idea of masculinity to some extent or another. And this creates problems because if you say masculinity includes a bunch of negative characteristics, which it does because men behave worse than women, but linking these negative characteristics inherently to someone's identity, which they can't control, could potentially be problematic. If someone is a trans man, for example, they identify as a man, it's inevitable that they will associate themselves with masculinity. And then if you say, well, what's masculinity? Killing and raping people. Well, that's gonna obviously be a problem. It could potentially be dangerous in the sense of it might encourage, and it's unlikely, but we don't want to take the risk of encouraging people engaging in those behaviors because they think that that's connected to their identity. But also, it's gonna negatively impact that person's self-esteem and their sense of self because they're gonna think, who am I? I'm the murdering and raping person, or I'm part of that group that's defined by those things. And so for those reasons, I don't support the use of masculinity and femininity discourse. We can talk about those correlations, we can talk about differences in behavior between men and women without using masculinity and femininity discourse. We can just say men are overrepresented among perpetrators of violent crimes. And we don't have to label those behaviors as masculine in order to highlight this correlation. Now, the second sense of masculinity and femininity discourse is a normative sense. Now, with the normative sense of masculine and feminine discourse, positive qualities are included under both masculine and feminine. So masculine positive qualities might include things like courage or protecting others or something like that. I'm not a fan of the protecting others thing, especially since it implies that, for example, women can't protect themselves, and it's at least borderline sexist, if not downright sexist. But in any case, whatever the positive characteristics are, those are then included under masculinity, and positive characteristics are also included under femininity. For some reason, people do a lot more masculinity discourse than femininity discourse. I wonder if there's a sexism behind that too. But in any case, this creates its own problem. Why are there distinct characteristics for men and women? After all, what is virtuous and what isn't is not dependent on gender. If courage is a virtue, it's no more a virtue for men than it is for women. It's just as good for a woman to be courageous as it is for a man to be courageous. It is just as good for a man to be compassionate as for a woman to be compassionate. And so compassion being considered a feminine virtue, what's feminine about it? I mean, what makes virtues good is independent of gender. And so it would make more sense to have some sort of ideal of virtue, which is a gender-neutral ideal, instead of having gendered ideals of virtue. And it's very difficult to avoid sexism and heteronormativity when we have gendered ideals. It's a traditional old-fashioned way of thinking that, say, courage is a specifically masculine virtue. Why? Is it because you assume women are less courageous than men, which is definitely not true? Is it because you think it's not important for women to be courageous? And what sorts of relationships between men and women and status of men and women in society does this encourage? The kinds of things that involve being in a position of greater power are more likely to be associated even with ideal masculinity, and the kinds of things associated with helping others are more likely to be associated even with ideal femininity. So then compassion and care, which are good qualities, it's good for the person themselves actually, because from a spiritual point of view, it's good to be good. The worst off people are evildoers. Evildoers are the worst off because first of all, they're separated from God. When they allow themselves to fall into evil, they separate themselves from God, which involves a certain suffering in and of itself. There's depression and negative states associated with that because happiness and pleasure in a higher sense, not lower pleasures, are also associated with God's presence, and you have less of that God's presence when you separate yourself from God by being evil. And then on top of that, they have bad karma, and they will face karmic retribution, which will involve additional suffering. But as far as external material circumstances are concerned, as far as power relations are concerned, it seems to be geared toward men's power. So men are doing things like protecting people and being brave, which involves being in a position of leadership, whereas women are doing things like taking care of people and being compassionate, which involves sort of bolstering or supporting others. Or in the very least, it doesn't involve being in a position of leadership. And so that still seems to have a sexist assumption behind it. Now, if you make the same qualities present within masculine or feminine, there's no difference between them, other than the label of masculine or feminine, but then what is that label? It's just a sound. So if courage is both a masculine virtue and a feminine virtue, compassion is both a masculine virtue and a feminine virtue, and so on, where you have exactly the same notion of virtue present in both masculinity and femininity, then this is not a gendered notion of virtue anymore. This is a gender neutral notion of virtue that you have decided for some reason to pointlessly associate gendered labels with. I don't think it's ever going to get to the point where we have a completely gender neutral notion that people are labeling as masculine or feminine, but I imagine if we did that, eventually people would just stop labeling it as masculine or feminine and will just use gender neutral language in recognition of the fact that this is actually a gender neutral notion. That is a reason against having an ideal or a normative notion of masculinity and femininity. So what is left? Should we simply eliminate all concepts of masculine or feminine? No, because people's gender identities are, like I said, and this is an inevitability. I don't see any way to avoid this. Not that I'm trying to avoid it, but I just don't see any way to avoid it. It's inevitably going to be connected with masculinity and femininity. If somebody says masculine and there's a person who identifies as a man, they will associate that with themselves. If someone says feminine and there's a person who identifies as a woman, they will associate that with themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having a gender identity, having a gender expression, being a man, being a woman, being non-binary. And there's ways to do that that are not sexist, that are not homophobic, transphobic, or anything bad. But then we have to limit our use of masculinity and femininity to gender identity and gender expression. So then masculinity only is identifying as a man, that is self-categorizing into the social category men. That's what gender identity is. In this case, male gender identity. It just is gender identity, and then gender expression, which is about what you look like for the most part, but also maybe to some extent your mannerisms and stuff. So hairstyle, clothing, to some extent style of speech and mannerisms, but then also like jewelry and other things. I have no problem with those things being gendered. Having some difference between like the kinds of clothes that are more like men's clothes and women's clothes and so on, I think that's fine. And that is something that allows people to express their gender identity, and that seems to be natural for human beings. Not having a gender identity, not having a preferred gender expression, not having a natural tendency toward having certain kinds of mannerisms, not having any desire to participate in things that are considered masculine or feminine, that doesn't seem to be a very natural condition for human beings. It doesn't seem that that kind of gender abolitionism, which many years ago, over a decade ago, I supported to some extent. I don't even know what was going on. I was a weirdo in those days. And that kind of gender abolitionism is not something that is going to ever work. It's not something I support, and it's not feasible. It's not going to happen that like no one's going to have a gender identity and nothing's going to be considered masculine and feminine. No, some things will be considered masculine and feminine because that's natural. Just it's in human nature somehow. I guess the higher spiritual reason behind this is that there's a division, there is some sort of distinction between God and the Divine Mother. You can also experience the supreme reality in a way where that distinction doesn't apply or isn't salient or something. But nevertheless, there is some distinction, and I've experienced this spiritually. Manhood and womanhood, this distinction is based on the distinction between God and the Divine Mother. And even the division in nature between male and female, like the physical sort of division, is also based on that higher division. I'm using division very broadly here, but that higher distinction. So that is a spiritual explanation between why sex and gender exist at all. Whatever you think the explanation is, even if you don't believe in spiritual things or whatever, you can clearly see that's part of human nature. And it's not going to be a successful project to try to make every single thing gender neutral and have nobody have any gender identity at all. Not to mention that people, because it's natural, they will of course take some degree of pleasure, the so-called gender euphoria that people sometimes talk about. I don't like these terms gender dysphoria and gender euphoria personally, but whatever terms you use for it, there is a certain enjoyment that people will sometimes get from gender stuff. Trans people often experience this, and even if one doesn't necessarily frame it in terms of enjoyment or experience it as enjoyment, it's something that at least feels authentic. So for me, I wouldn't say so. I mean, I guess I have had gender euphoria as well, although again, not my preferred term, but I have experienced stuff like that. It's not super important in my life, but I have experienced it. But it's more important to me to just be natural or authentic, right? So forcing myself to be feminine is unnatural. Being masculine is more natural for me. And when you are authentic, you will be happier and experience more pleasure, in a higher sense of pleasure, than if you're not authentic. So for some people, that the pleasurableness of it might be what's salient. For some people, the authenticity might be what's salient. But regardless, that will exist. And so we should preserve some notion of masculinity and femininity, but we should limit it to gender identity and gender expression, and not gender other things as much as possible. If we want to talk about men behaving badly, instead of saying, oh, this is masculinity for you. I saw this trans woman YouTuber who said that Donald Trump was the ultimate in masculinity, that he was like the epitome of masculinity. I don't know what that means. Unless masculinity is just another word for everything bad. I don't have anything against this YouTuber. It's just that specific comment was a bit odd, because I don't think Donald Trump is any more masculine than like a random man picked off the street. His gestures, the way he kind of moves his hands around is a little bit flamboyant, which is something that's more associated with femininity. I'm not going to label him as feminine because he identifies as a man and is broadly speaking masculine presenting, which reminds me that we also have to take the whole person, the whole context into consideration, even when we're talking about the masculinity or femininity of mannerisms and physical characteristics and or gender expression things. So, even something like a beard is masculine. I'm okay with labeling certain physical characteristics as masculine and feminine. Overall, in a general way, I think it's right to say that beards are masculine. But if a woman has PCOS, let's say, and has a beard, then her beard specifically isn't masculine, because her overall femininity, if she's a feminine woman, her overall femininity negates the masculinity of the beard. There will be a certain incongruity at first when one sees it, because it's atypical for, women typically don't have beards. It is a male secondary sex characteristic. Nevertheless, she is a woman and she is feminine. And so in that context, the beard isn't masculine anymore. And so the gender identity can influence whether some gender expression thing is masculine or feminine as well. But we can still say that certain things are generally masculine and generally feminine. So we can criticize people like Donald Trump for being narcissistic. And yes, narcissism is a characteristic that's more present in men than women. And so it is a masculine characteristic on the descriptive sense of masculine. But we should not be using these words in that descriptive sense for the reason I've already explained earlier. We can talk about men behaving badly, and we should. The way in which many men think of what they're supposed to be like as men, what it means to be a man, that does need to get revised. We need to start normalizing the characteristics that are traditionally seen as feminine in men, and the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to ungender them. Instead of gendering them as masculine, which is meaningless, instead of saying, well, you can be soft-hearted and compassionate, those can be masculine qualities. What's masculine about soft-heartedness and compassion? Nothing. They're not masculine in a descriptive sense because they're less present in men than women. How is being a man linked to compassion and care inherently, that you could use that to construct even an ideal or normative notion of masculinity? So let's just not consider personality traits to be masculine and feminine in the first place. Compassion is neither masculine nor feminine. It is just a virtue. This is my proposal anyway. I realize there could be nuances, and this doesn't cover all of the ins and outs of like when we use gender discourse, but I think I've laid out the sort of bare bones of my position when it comes to this, which is not gender abolitionism, but it is for ungendering most things, but keeping some gender stuff or gender identity and gender expression in a way where we take the whole context, which is the whole person, into consideration, and still being able to criticize the bad behaviors of men without perpetuating essentialism or prejudice.